Game to change. Excellence in learning design. Prototyping for learning design. At Game to Change, we believe learning should be an active and creative experience. Holistic understanding. Your environment is unique and so are your people. We listen and design with you at the center. Experiential learning. People are not robots. Our designs focus on engagement and interactivity. Outcomes driven. We measure what we deliver to drive consistency and continuous improvement. As we progress through our series and the 4 diamonds, we now dive into the 3rd diamond, prototype. We will be covering aspects such as techniques and tools to apply, wireframe, paper, and service blueprints and when to use them, and lastly, the do's and don'ts of prototyping. Without further ado, let's jump into part 3 of our Excellence in Learning Design series.
Great. So welcome everyone. Welcome to our third in our webinar series, prototyping, which we're really excited to be introducing. I just want to say hi to everyone. I see Michael, Rihanna, Diovolt, Jeannie van der Merwe. Hello everyone. If you want to introduce yourself in the chat, that's also great. So without further ado, we're going to kick off with the prototyping for learning design. And I'm going to introduce you to myself. So I'm Deirdre Jensen, and I look at game-based and learning design, running Game to Change with a number of years experience in learning design. Then you'll see on the screen to my left is Simon. Simon has got a lot of experience in game design and actually is going to be giving us some samples from the game industry and how we can apply it to learning. And then to my left, we have Daniela, who really looks at the motivation, and in the series, she's going to be giving us some insight to some of the projects that we've run and we've run using prototyping, what worked, what didn't work. So from us to you, welcome. And just to kick off with the agenda, so we've obviously booked an hour. We're going to keep it to 40 minutes. We want to make it short, punchy, to the point, and give you as much practical tools that you can go and apply. What are we covering? We're going to just give you a quick overview of why prototyping, what's actually happened in learning design, and why is prototyping becoming so important. Then we're going to look at what is prototyping, so just give you some context to it. And then we're going to be moving into the types of prototyping. So because it's relatively new in learning design, we wanted to bring in a more mature model, particularly in the video game design and how effectively they've done it, and then compare it to how we can implement it in instructional or learning design. And then we're going to speak around some of the key principles and tips to keep in mind when you are doing this. A quick overview video of the benefits, and then finally some practical tips. So we're going to keep it to 40 minutes. We're going to make it engaging. Please feel free to put any questions in the chat. So we want it not to be a talking head. So we want this to be engaging, practical. We'll also be sending out a toolkit afterwards, and we've got something exciting at the end, which we're going to be offering to our attendees. So I'm going to hand over to Simon. This is our first part of the series to engage with you.
Fantastic. So if you have been to our other webinars, you'll have known this process beforehand, and we want to get some of your input already. So what I'm going to ask you to do is to open up your browser, so your Chrome or your Internet Explorer, and we're going to go to menti.com. How it's going to look is something like this. So again, let me copy that code into the Zoom chat. There you go. You can hit that link and it'll pop up onto your web-based browser. And then I'm going to give you a code. So in this case, it's going to be 404750. So let me also copy that in. And what we're asking is, what are some of the challenges you face when doing learning design? These could be immediate things that pop off your head. This could be a long-term problem that you've been having, but essentially copy the code and put it into the Menti site and hit submit. What's going to happen then is it's going to ask you to put in some words. So in this case, for me, what challenges do I face with learning design? I face client relations. I think client relations is probably one of my biggest troubles. And then I'm thinking also maybe budget. You know, how much do I put in to doing these design works? Once I'm happy with everything, I'm going to hit submit. And then what's going to be really cool is we're going to see everyone's responses, and they're going to start popping up on screen. So you can see people have done it, which is fantastic. So maybe me and Deirdre, if you want to go through a couple of them, that'll be quite cool.
Right.
So I should also point out, if you say a word, and other people say the same word, it's going to make the text bigger. So yeah, I mean, right away we have feedback.
It's a great way of just seeing what people are experiencing and sharing it with us. So, I mean, I'm just going to quickly go through. I think feedback, definitely. Like the more we're working, you'll see I mentioned the whole experience of we're working in a much more complex environment, and how do we understand what's going on around us, and getting feedback. Buy-in from exec sponsors, definitely. Complex corporates, I know we work with clients, and there's many stakeholders. Content gathering, exactly. It's not a simple process anymore. There's many dimensions. Budgets, time, money, costs. We always want to build the Rolls Royce.
I'm seeing content flow. So maybe the idea of how do you plan out your content, or where does your content fall into? I should also point out quickly, guys, that we're going to be asking you another question later on in the webinar series. So you'll see the screen over here, which is please wait for the presenters to show next slide. Don't worry, don't close your web browser. Just keep it up and keep it open. I'll get back to this a bit later on. But anyway, let's continue on. We have delivery methodology.
And that's, I mean, it's what's happened in learning design, very similar to software development, is long processes. Now we don't have that luxury. Things have to be built quickly, and how do we do it and still keep quality standards?
Transfer effectiveness, would that be moving from from the team into the client space, and how do you make sure that's as smoothly as possible?
Yeah, and I think, Simon, it also speaks about once the learning happens, how are people applying it, and are they actually getting the results? I mean, I think that talks to your return on investment. And yeah, I mean, this will be interesting in our prototyping. We're gonna bring some of that in. So I think that's some good challenges, and we've certainly faced all of those. Unfortunately, there's no silver bullet, but through all of these conversations, we can get better at what we do and how we address these challenges. So thank you for sharing, everyone.
And it's also the what we're seeing with these challenges. It's not just at the beginning of the design phase, it's actually the whole way through, you know, from the initial concepting all the way through to client handoff. People have some issues, but we can put that to a side now and move on a bit. You're going to explain to us why prototyping in learning design.
Great. So I'm not, I don't want to get too theoretical, but for me, it's very interesting because, a couple of years back when I started, when I had a sort of academic background, and I had to actually now practically design programs. And my first really good old friend was Addy. I'm sure everyone, and we still use elements of Addy. And it was great. We very much had more of a research focus. It was systematic, it was linear. So I'm sure a lot of people can relate, but I mean, from my experience, one of the biggest challenges was we do these incredible research analysis and put these beautiful design documents together as a team. We'd present it to our clients and people who'd be delivering it. Either we'd totally bomb out and we'd have to go back to the drawing board, or there'd be a huge gap between design, development, and what the actual final product looked like. Some big discrepancies around that. So I think that certainly showed me that there were gaps in having a very linear, systematic model. And I think particularly with what we're experiencing now is we're moving into you know, as we say, this VUCA world, which I know it's a little bit of an overuse, but it is. And we're having to design learning that is really far more sophisticated. So, you know, where before if you were in corporate training, it was very much task, product focused. It was about being functional, reliable, usable. Now we've taken that gap to actually convenience. So this has very much been driven by intuitive design, like we see with our phones. People want the same experience in their learning, to also being pleasurable. So the thing is, we are so overstimulated with information that if something doesn't have an emotional connection, the chance of it actually landing is very, very, very slim. So it's got to connect us in some way, and then meaningful. So limited time, limited capacity. You've probably all experienced it. People have to know where's the value in their life for that. So we've got to be able to design more than both the functional but also the experiential qualities. And it's tricky. It's multi-dimensional. And I think one of the things that I've seen is, and I can actually compare it to moving from being very much research focused to more of working like an architect with so many dimensions. And we've got to bring in different models and different approaches to making our learning design meet all these requirements. And prototyping, and I'm going to start by introducing prototyping in terms of just a very simple explain how we do our learning design. And it's nothing new. We've taken design thinking, we've still taken aspects of instructional design because there's still a lot of value. And then there's prototyping. So we really start with the discover. And the discover is a bit of analysis. The discover is in terms of understanding your user, your learner, what are their preferences, what is the things that they make an emotional connection with. You get a sample audience of it. And this is very much from design thinking. We use empathy canvas maps. You can interview your learners. You can also get qualitative data from them. So that's really about gathering not just analytical data, but also the deep experiences of that sample of learners. And then we really look at taking our general problem. So what is the learning problem? What do we want to change in people? Is it a skill? Is it a behavior? And really defining it into what is the actual problem. And then once we're clear on that, this is when we go into our more creative side, where we ideate, where we start building our prototypes. And I'm going to go into a little bit more detail around what this process looks like. But you can see it's very much a spiral or an iterative process. And the prototyping is where we get to start to hone our design, our creativity, and match it to our learners' needs and their environment. And then once we've decided we've got as close a fit based on our time and our resources, we go into development and involvement. And that can also be iterative. So that's just very at a high level where we fit prototyping in. I want to now go into the detail of how we understand prototyping. And I'm sure for most of you, there is, you've done it in piloting, you've done it in experimentation. I do see there is a question on the chat, and I will refer to it and give you some examples when Simon's speaking. So if we go into the next slide and we look at prototyping. So what is prototyping? So prototyping is really a physical model of a rough idea. It allows you to take the idea that you have and put it onto some kind of physical model. It's used not just in terms of, it helps you through your thinking and communicating with your learners and stakeholders. You bring them into the process a lot easier, a lot sooner. You can also use it to think through any potential problems or any potential barriers. The learners can give you feedback on that. Prototyping is also a great way of when you've got a lot of interactivity. And how do you actually test how that interactivity will work with them without expending a huge amount of time and development costs? So Simon, if you just go up to the previous slide, the actual, you'll see at the bottom, that loop is when we get to ideating. What we do is we go through a lot of, we brainstorm, we do very much divergent thinking, coming up with ideas of how we think we can solve that problem. And then we choose, we have certain criteria around feasibility and viability, and we choose an idea that it can be one or many ideas that we want to prototype. And this is something that we want to test out. And as you'll see, prototyping can be as simple as a drawing on a whiteboard, or it can level up and become more complex as a user interface. So we actually put our prototype forward, we design it with minimal time and costs, and we use it to test with our learners and to get feedback. We then document this feedback, and then we can either decide if this feedback warrants us refining that prototype, or do we start with a new idea. So that's really, and that, as you can see, is very much a spiraled loop. So you can do this. You can do this a number of times. It is determined on your time and your budget allocation. It is also, you know, I think that's one of the downfalls of prototyping, is you can get into this loop infinitely, and you can end up spending all your time prototyping and you never achieve perfection, when what you want to do is a minimum viable product. So it does require some discernment. So just some examples of where does prototyping really work well. What we've seen, if you're going into a new area where there's no previous research, there's no previous content, you do want to do a prototyping as an experiment to understand your environment better. The other thing is, if you're looking at designing high interactivity, and I think this is where it really works with game design, we've done tactile board games, and you really need to understand how your user engages and their responses to it. It's very suitable. So those are just some of the areas where prototyping is very, very well suited. Just in terms of other ways of doing it, if you want to really, you feel quite stuck in your design and you've got a very risk-averse stakeholder group, and you want to bring in more creative ideas or bolder ideas, and you can't take that risk of a big budget, what you may want to do is use prototyping to test those bolder ideas and get your user or your learner feedback on that, and getting buy-in to that before you go into a big budget or a lot of time that you spend around it. So those are just some examples of where prototyping really works well. As I said before, I think one of the downsides is it can be an endless loop. So you've got to know of when to start off. Also, you've also got to know when your feedback warrants you to start from scratch again. And Daniela will be speaking through some of those principles.
Cool, thanks for that. Well, we obviously been talking about like what prototypes and what they are, but we haven't really looked at what are they. Let's go through some visual prototypes instead. So I'm going to start off talking about game design, and then we're going to recycle it back into learning design, and then I'll show you a few more prototypes after that. But with game design, this is particularly with video games, and these are some things familiar, but with video games, you're never going to get the full product immediately. You have to take it step by step. And this is where these prototypes kind of come into play, because you're essentially trying to build like a layered cake. You know, you're starting with the very basics and then building up and building up and building up. And we can see it here in these prototyping examples. So the very first thing game designers will tend to do is they'll come up with a game design idea in their head, and then they'll map it onto paper itself. So here you can see very much Pac-Man, the video game, a very rudimentary form of it. But in this case, they're just trying to work out how it's going to have the general feel and how it's going to look and what it should be shown on screen. You can see you can move the paper Pac-Man around. You can pick up the little paper bits, obviously be eaten, and what happens if a ghost catches up to them. Then what game designers do is they'll take these paper prototypes and they'll move more into the virtual space. This is when they actually dive into their programming and their coding, and they still try and keep it as simple as possible. So they don't want to waste graphic designers' time coming up with all these fancy models. They don't want to take up concept artists' time or even animators' time. because they'll be busy working on other projects. So instead, what they do is they start from what essentially is called white boxing. This is where all your characters, all your interactivities, all your environments are essentially white boxes. So you, for example, your character could be a circle, like a red circle. Your enemies could all be blue squares. And the gun, if you're doing a gun or first-person shooter, whatever, your gun simply could just be a long tube. And so now what you're trying to see is how is your game going to be interacting with these elements in this kind of 3D space. Once they've kind of are happy with that, they then go into sandboxing. This is when they have more detailed models. Maybe they want to test interactions, like if you have a bullet, how does the bullet interact with it going past maybe their neck? What is the hitbox, for example? Or maybe they want to see what happens if your character starts jumping up more complicated building blocks. You know, instead of squares, how their character is going to interact if they're trying to climb up a wall. So this is the kind of sandboxing phase. And again, these are all prototypes. These are far away from what the finished product will eventually look like. Once they're happy with that, they then obviously go to their visual artists and they start saying, okay, well, we need to start making this world. We need to start making this game look appealing to our players. And this is when the vertical slice comes into play. This is when graphic designers will sit down and say, okay, we want it to look like this. And they'll then put that stuff into the game, but it's still going to be a really rough copy. So here you can see them doing some rough outlines of maybe what their buildings in the game are going to be like. So this is giving a great feel of what the overall world should look like, but it's still very bland and still very textureless. But if you go on, this is by Black Deer Games, you can see the kind of step-by-step process of what they've taken. They went from white boxing and a sandbox approach to a more vertical slice. We can start seeing how the world is going to be fleshed out, how this game is going to be interactive. And then in the final version, this is not even the final version, but you can start to see them add things like lighting effects. You can start to see them add more complicated mechanics like a sleeping mode. And again, this is all by doing prototype after prototype after prototype and breaking down each individual mechanic and testing that perfectly before moving on to the next approach. You don't want your visual artist to be working on a character if you're not going to use the character in the next draft, because it's just wasted time. But that's all game design stuff. Let's talk more about learning design prototyping, Deirdre.
Great. So as you could see, in the game design industry, there's quite a bit of maturity, and as we start to apply this and prototyping in learning design, we are evolving how we do it. And I think with one of the first very valuable insights I got was to actually use what they've used in customer experience, which is service blueprints. So we're moving from content to an experience. And in experience, there are various touch points and stages of what you're going to be engaging, what the learner is going to be engaging with, what their feedback is. And it really is helpful to map that out and to get a sample of users and be able to role play, to see how smooth is that process. And this very much talks to that whole intuitive convenience. So, I mean, you can see with how, with mobile smart devices, it's designed in such a way that you intuitively get how everything flows. And that's what we've got to understand in terms of our learning design, is how do we make it more intuitive? And service blueprints, which is really the touch points, and then testing those touch points and refining it is really important for your overall learning experience.
Sorry to disturb you. Is this like you're testing the onboarding session, you're testing the first round of content going forward?
Exactly, Simon. So it's almost your high level for me. It's taking your high level structure and seeing how it flows. And then you can start to prototype the components sitting in that. So as we know, learning experience design is not just one component, it's a combination of that. And this is where your service blueprint can be really valuable for mapping out those points right up front and testing them with your learners.
Cool. Yeah, so that's obviously related to learning design, but I guess if we want some more examples, we can look to other industries. And again, we should also point out your prototypes are going to differ based on what you're doing. We're talking about learning design prototypes this time. We've shown you game design prototypes, but it really depends on what industry you're in, because there's going to be different ways of prototyping. So if we just keep going on, we can look at maybe storyboarding. This is predominantly used in the video industry or the film industry to build scenes and see how the scenes are going to look far before you have a camera and you have your actors and you have your sets. It's a great way to see what the mood is going to be like, how your characters should be interacting with each other, and how the general flow of the film could be. And you might actually use this in learning design because you might have, as part of some of your sections, it might be videos. So how do you make sure that those videos are coming across properly? You'll do a storyboard. If you look at instructional design, so this is more maybe like app focused, we see that it still starts off with paper prototyping. Paper prototyping is fantastic because it's cheap. It's very cheap, it's very cost effective, and it's easy to put onto paper. So it's fast to do so. Instead of having to work through coding and build the app in the first place, you can see how there's going to be interactions simply by using paper itself. So in this case, you can see them laying out the different UI elements onto the paper. Once they're kind of happy with their with their general layout, they'll move to what is called a wireframe approach. This is where you start doing the basic coding design of your app, or maybe your website or whatever it is, but you extract a lot, or you remove a lot of the unnecessary features. So in this case, it would be like things like images, or things like what the buttons, or what is the font going to be. You remove a lot of that because that comes later on. That's the visual stylings, that's the look and feel. Right now, you're just trying to build a very much skeleton structure in a sense of how can a skeleton move about. And then finally, you have the refined digital stage. This is where you actually start putting in your visual elements. You decide on your button shapes, if they should be square or should they be circles. You decide on some of the visual stylings, like what kind of color palette you'll be going for. And again, these are all to test different things. With wireframing, it's to test to see if the coding is going to hold up. With refined digital, it's testing to see what the visual stylings feel and look like, and if they're what you want to be. Yeah, and there's also a great way to show your clients in that this is the rough draft of what your visuals should eventually be, because you don't want your graphic designer spending all their time working on a masterpiece and then your client turns around and says, well, no, that's not really what we actually wanted. So these are all examples of prototyping to save you time, save you energy, and save you money.
I think that's a famous byline, but I think also something else to bring in is that, you know, if you've done a couple of prototypes and you really need to do one final test round, you might want to take a vertical slice. And a vertical slice is really doing a component of that learning. And you've also got to be quite discerning what you take. So you've got to take maybe a unit or something that can stand alone, because we're not just looking at the user interface, we're also looking at how the content comes across. Is it able to create the change, and use that vertical slice to actually get someone to go through that process, that prototyping process, and give feedback, and also test whether the actual learning happened as well. So that's really where you're taking it to the next level of your prototyping before going into development.
Cool. So I think, you know, we've kind of chatted about what prototyping is, and I think what's really important is to understand that when you do start prototyping for the first time, there is a big mindset change that needs to happen both internally and with external stakeholders. So it really is opening up some change management conversations with the people that are involved with your prototyping phases. So I'm just going to go through 6 principles to just really keep in mind when you start prototyping. The first one is to acknowledge and embrace the intent of a prototype. So I think one of the biggest mistakes that has been made, and in our team as well, is thinking that your prototype must be very close to your final draft, and that's not the case. It's really just starting a dialogue and a conversation to take your idea from your head and put it on paper or online to test your assumptions and your ideas with other people. A prototype is designed for failure, and sometimes it's really hard to work with that kind of mindset, but we need to just remember that if our prototype is closer, if we're getting that feedback, it's closer to success. So we just need to kind of be a little bit detached when we get feedback and, you know, our ideas are either shot down or we're seeing where things aren't working. So it's really just becoming detached to your prototype. The second one is to act quickly. And this is sometimes a challenge when you're working with external stakeholders. It's very difficult, to get people together and sit with a prototype. But ideally, it should follow immediately after an ideation session. The more time that passes between your ideation and your prototyping, you're less likely to remember the intent of your idea and what the initial goal and objective was. So we really want to prototype after an idea surfaces. A lot of teams will do ideation in the morning and then prototyping in the afternoon, so that it's at least in one day.
Great. So Daniela, I just want to also just bring in, we did a session with clients where we interviewed on the first day, and we did a whole lot of interviews with stakeholders, and we ideated and we prototyped the next day, and we got such a good feedback from our initial learners, where they actually saw their questions being answered in that prototype. So I think it is very gratifying for them, and also gets buy-in a lot earlier.
And I think you're just creating like a very collaborative environment with the prototyping. Then the third point is to clearly set the expectations of your testers. So I think something that I do just want to touch on is you get prototyping and you're getting testing and feedback within that, but it's not the same as user testing of your final product. So the testers in your prototype need to have a very clear understanding of what this prototype is supposed to be. It's not supposed to be the final product. You need to explain that it's going to be a bit messy, and that you want them to focus on the interaction and not the look and feel. So best practice is to use black and white stick figures so people don't get distracted by colors or imagery or anything like that. And it's really just about that communication and explaining what you want your prototype to be. The fourth one is linked to the previous point, is providing clear instructions, but acting as an observer. So I think when you have people testing your prototype, it's very easy to get involved and trying to direct their flow and how they're using your ideas. So it's really just about allowing free exploration so that you can see how people would naturally interact with your product. So often people even do live iterations. So as you're seeing people interact with your design, you can actually change things then and there and see how they interact with that change. So it really allows for a better second iteration of your prototype. The fifth point is something I struggle with, and it's to be mentally prepared to scrap it and start over. So prototyping isn't a one-time event. And so after a prototype session, you need to be prepared to scrap the idea. If it's not working, if it's not meeting your goal or your objective, you need to scrap it and start again. Sometimes this even leads to another ideation session. So really go back and understand your problem a bit better and then come up with a new prototype. Again, this also links to real-time iteration. So you can then scrap it then and there and draw up another prototype with your testers if it is a struggle to get people in the same room. The sixth one is then to use the appropriate type of prototype. So I think this is something that Simon also touched on. So you get different levels. You get your sketching, which could be on a whiteboard, it can be on paper. You get your functional prototype, which can also still be on paper, but this is more linked to your wireframes. You have your media prototypes, which you're then bringing in imagery and graphics. And then you have your content prototype for learning. And it's really about putting a slice of content together, but enough that a user can already see, is it applicable? Does the content match the design? So something that we have done before is and I think this is something when you're dealing with external stakeholders, is you want it to look as nice and as pretty and as aesthetically pleasing as possible. But often you actually take away from the prototype. So leave the media for last, leave your imagery and design for last in your prototyping phases. So from that, we actually just want to share with you some lessons that we've learned in our prototyping experience. So something that we did, I think it was last year, we developed a product. It wasn't for a client, so it was an internal product, and it was for agile development and within the agile industry. So this product, I think it took us over a year. We were sitting developing this product, and eventually after long hours and grueling feedback, we decided that it wasn't doing what it needed to do, but it was way too late down the line, to cut it. So one of the biggest mistakes is getting feedback from the right user group. So we were getting various users together to test the prototype. Some were familiar with Agile and some weren't familiar with Agile. And what this did was, after we had a prototyping session, some of the feedback was that the content or the design was too challenging. And so then we would change it for that user group. And then we would do another user testing. And then they said, no, the content and the interaction was too easy. So it's really important to match your testers for your prototype to your ultimate user group. The second one was focusing on changing one variable at a time. So often we would get feedback from the prototyping session and we'd want to fix everything. So every negative feedback we got, we wanted to fix it. And what it did is it just made each iteration look completely different from the other, as opposed to focusing on one variable, having a prototype session and clearly communicating, this is what I want you to test and this is what I want you to focus on. It could be one mechanic, it could be one visual design, but really to focus on one thing at a time.
Yeah.
The third mistake we made
I just want to interrupt you there. Getting back to that kind of like the variable thing is, do you tell the testers to focus on that variable or that mechanic, or do you tell them to go freely explore the game? Because if they're focusing too much on that variable, they might not give you the right feedback that you want necessarily. And also, like game design, there's a lot of interconnecting elements to it. So yeah, like I fully agree. Like you should always test one variable. I mean, it is scientific, right? You test one variable to see what the results are, and then you change that variable to see how the results differ based on that variable. But I think also like we do have to keep in mind of clients and time pressure and management of like how many prototypes can we get away with. So we do have to be conscious of that.
And I think it's also just deciding which prototypes you want to invite your stakeholders into. So if you're doing really rough prototyping, you can keep it into your internal team and just get feedback from your teammates to test your assumptions. And once you feel like your prototype is at a reasonable level, you can then start engaging with your stakeholders.
And it's also how strong is your relationship. So the one thing is prototyping does require change in mindset. It does becoming more transparent with your stakeholders. As Daniela said, it's not going to be this beautiful, it's going to be very rough. And if you have that kind of, well, if I see something rough, this is what I think my end product's going to look like. So it does require a more robust relationship with your stakeholders to be able to be more transparent in the design process.
Yeah. So then just our third point was, our mistake was that we didn't throw in the towel early on. So I think this was very apparent when we then had 3 different designs for 3 different objectives. And that for us should have been a huge warning bell to say, okay, we had an idea, we had a problem we wanted to solve, and we then just had so many variations, and the problem, we ended up changing the problem and what we wanted to solve through the process. So that was a really big learning for us, just to have decided on a lot earlier to say, okay, this isn't working. We would have saved so much time and money in the process.
Yeah, so I mean, that slide, you can actually see, I mean, we actually got into one of the loops of one of the, we didn't even realize it, is that we're just prototyping indefinitely, using the wrong stakeholders, using the wrong process and feedback. So yeah, it was a really big amateur mistake, and it did cost time and money, unfortunately.
Yeah.
So I think that was big learning, and I think we wanted to share that it doesn't always. We have shared like the scars and been pretty transparent, but we also want to share with you where we really have done it well, and we want to share a project that really went well, where we used prototyping and we did it correctly, and our learnings from that. So we just want to we want to put those slides up on the screen. So maybe if Daniela can quickly do a slide share. So that was the testing of the agile, and people came in and they had an experience. I mean, we gave people some great experiences, if nothing else.
Yeah. So this was a successful prototyping, experience that we had. And I think it was just because we followed the process and we involved stakeholders from the beginning. So what we started with was we did a theme ideation with our stakeholders, and we got them to really just sit and brainstorm, and it was very experiential and interactive. You can see there was lots of drawing and color involved, and this was just bringing them into the process to kind of get this theme ideation or what they wanted this product to look like. From that, we then went into the second day, which is where we then reviewed the categories and the content with them. And you can see there was lots of diagrams and brainstorming that happened. And I think what was really interesting with this session is how people leveraged off of each other's ideas. So you know how they say, like, you know, 4 heads are better than one. And it was really just like they were able to expand on each other's ideas, and they were all involved in the business, and they all had insight into the areas of the business that everyone else didn't. So from this, we then went into the selection of the theme and the prototype design. So you can see there's the very rough drawing on paper that we did with our stakeholders in a workshop. And then we kind of put a rough idea onto some, with a little bit of imagery. And I think that this is something that is important when you're dealing with external stakeholders. They are very, very keen to see the aesthetics of it. And then from that, we then went on to user testing and feedback. So you can see there we already had almost the final design, but the prototype session was all on paper. So everything was still on paper, and we got people to come and test the game-based experience, play it. We already tested the content in that session as well. And then once we had that, we refined all the feedback, updated it, and then we launched it. So you can see it's now printed on vinyl. All the cards are printed, large groups that interacted with the product. And this was a really successful prototyping process that we went through.
And they actually, just to put it into that, they actually took this into digital as well. So it helped them that they understood how the mechanics worked, and then they could actually then take it into a digital frame of mind. So that's exactly, I mean, I see, Michael, you've given us a question of the current pandemic, and something that we've been doing during this time is we've taken some of our tactile board games, and we've gone through the process of using those as prototypes to move them into digital. And it's quite there's a very different engagement level, and we've certainly learned a lot. But if we didn't have an initial prototype, I don't think we could have been as far as we act with some of our gamified learning experiences.
And at the same time, you should also point out that there are online tools to kind of replicate the same feeling of paper prototyping. So you could, I know there's like things like Mural, where you can load up a whole bunch of images and have a whole bunch of people play around with those images. So you do have like these whiteboard type of websites that you can utilize if you want to do that kind of paper prototyping approach. But lack of communication, Daniela?
Oh, so I mean, I think just based on where we went wrong as well was the fourth one was lack of communication with stakeholders and just not positioning our prototype correctly. So we did kind of position it as more of a final product than a prototype. And I think that's where when people think it's the final product, they're a lot harsher with their feedback. And so that was a lesson that we learned. And then obviously our one area of development is obviously we do go straight into media prototypes. So in one sense, it's important when you're using external stakeholders because they do want to see the look and feel. But I think for us, we learned that we'll do the internal prototypes in their rough format internally then with our team.
Yeah, I think it is just based on like what your team capabilities are, how busy are people, where you want to allocate your resources to these prototyping, because you can do a prototype with just 2 people and then show the rest of the team before moving on to bigger things.
Yeah, and I think something else we've done with our products and what we've learned is getting their time and getting their feedback is a lot more challenging than what it seems. People have got a limited time capacity. So that takes quite a bit of a time and energy around it. And it has to be thought through before you go into prototyping.
Okay, let's take a look at the benefits of prototyping.
5 benefits of prototyping for learning design. A prototype is developed to ensure the alignment of our understandings with the expectations of stakeholders. Involve your learners early on and minimize misunderstanding and incorrect assumption. A prototype helps us find the problems we will face while developing the final product. Taking into consideration these 3 aspects will allow you to resolve problems of functionality and compatibility whilst holistically achieving the process of design thinking. Once you resolve the problems in the prototyping stage, you will avoid rework to a great extent. Therefore, it shortens the overall process time dramatically whilst using minimal resources. Developing at least 3 prototypes provides opportunities for us to be more creative, and we start talking more constructively about design. This creates a well-rounded viewpoint, allowing for discussions on which prototype offers the most benefits and overall success. Lastly, prototyping is a collaborative process. It helps us analyze our learners' needs and helps us to distinguish how those needs can be met.
Fantastic. Well, next up, we're going to go back to Mentimeter because we want to ask another thing, or in this case, we're going to rate the usefulness of prototyping now that you have a better understanding of it. So what I'm going to ask everyone to do is go back to their Mentimeter, and what you now popped up is rate the usefulness of each prototyping benefit for you. So this should now have popped up if you didn't close it. If you have closed the website, don't worry. You can always again go to menti.com, so I'll link it, and you can always then type in the code, and that should give you access to the slides. You might have to first submit some words first for the other question. But what's going to happen is you're going to be shown 5 different sliders. It's the evidence of a plan, alignment with client expectations, finding problems of design, ensuring a more resource and time efficient process, and opportunities to be more creative. So what I would like from you guys is to rate them, rate the usefulness of these. So I think maybe just having a prototype is great as an evidence of plan. I might think that maybe alignment with client expectations might be middle. Finding problems, yes. Prototyping to find problems, absolutely. And ensure a more time intensive process. So depends on the prototype for me. And then opportunities to be more creative, I think that's a bit more high up. So I'm going to hit submit. And what's going to be really cool now is going to say thank you, but we can now see how everyone has now rated these usefulness when it comes to prototyping. So I think everyone's saying some quite high numbers for everything. And I think that this kind of stands to reason of how useful prototyping actually is.
And I think just to go and test it for yourself, I mean, this is just a way of obviously bringing prototyping into your design. And obviously there's not just one person, there's multiple people. So when you're doing something differently, you do have to get buy-in. And this is just a great way of selling the benefit and the extra time of prototyping. So I think we will let you vote on Menti. But as you're voting, I think we'll share the results right at the end. But we'd like to offer 3 participants who has an idea or have an idea, or would like to get some insight in terms of just some more detail around prototyping. We are offering a 1-hour session. It is obviously an online session with ourselves, where we will share some tools. We'll give you some feedback on where you're at and how you can do it. So the first 3 people to email me, so it's Deirdre@gametochange.co.za, we'll get those slots, and we'll slot it in at a time suitable to you. So you can see on your screen is the email. So we're offering this for your participation and being part of this opportunity to have a 1-hour slot to bring your idea if it hasn't been prototyped, or if you are down the line, if you want to bring this into your learning design process just to get our feedback. Also, we'll be able to engage with you directly and get your feedback on this. So we're offering those 3 consultation slots in the next month. From a Monday to Friday, we're pretty flexible. So we are on 2 hours, I think at the moment, 2 hours ahead of Central London time. So any time between, I guess, 10 to 12, 10 to 2 o'clock, sorry. with that hour. So please feel free to email me. And the first 3 we will slot in that session. We'll connect with you and have that session with you. And I think we'll also be able to gauge where everyone's at. So yeah, Simon, just to wrap it off.
Yeah, looking forward to seeing those seeing some of those creative ideas. And again, we should point out that it's still all yours. You completely own the IP, your intellectual property. We are just merely giving you advice on it. So don't worry about us taking it for ourselves. We want to support you as much as possible, but just kind of give you our expertise when it comes to that. We can quickly talk a bit more about how we're seeing these scales have come through in terms of usefulness. I like the evidence of a plan. I definitely like the idea that you can go from the design phase, do a prototype and think, okay, well, now where do we take it forward from that prototyping? Alignment of client expectations. I think this is kind of crucial because I think oftentimes when we interact with clients, we know what they want and we think they know what they want, and we kind of mix up sometimes, and we'll present an idea to them and then they can be like, oh wait, no, that's not really what we're looking at. So I think having a prototype for that is quite useful. Finding problems with design, yeah, it really is dependent on what people you're testing with. Where do you want your feedback with? What are you testing? Like, is it mechanics? Is it what variables you're testing? Because that's when you're going to be finding some of those problems. And sometimes you might not find a problem, which is quite nice. But then where do you go from there?
I think, Simon, just to put into that, we're working in this very complex environment. So when you experiment and you test, you get a better idea of what are some of the important variables. We don't have all the information. We've got to make certain calls and use our discernment. And I think that's where prototyping becomes really useful in understanding what works and what doesn't work in this complex environment.
So it might not be finding problems with the design, but it might be finding the important aspects of your design, and where do you really where do you capitalize on those things? Ensuring more time. This is the one that's the lowest down. Everything else is 7 or 8s. And I think it just speaks to the business itself. You obviously know how much time you can spend on these prototypes. We deal with clients who sometimes want to turn around of a day. And it's very hard to then justify having 3 prototypes in that one session. But sometimes if we're working with a client long term, we can give them a much more detailed response of like, this is the planning we're going to be doing, these are the prototypes we're going to be doing, this is where we're going to be showing you, and giving you a much more business structure to these designs. And then opportunities to be more creative. I think that really is quite the fun part of prototyping. It's when you see what's working in the prototype and being like, okay, well, let's kind of break off, let's branch off from this and see if we can kind of maybe come up with a new idea entirely. I think that's kind of where the opportunity to be more creative is. If I'm seeing a UI and I'm seeing people like to press the buttons, can I do a more button-focused design instead of maybe more text?
Great. So I think we really want to thank you for your time and for your participation. We hope you found value. We'd love to have gone into there's so much to this, but hopefully there's some tips and techniques that you can take out of it. We are going to be emailing through a toolkit based on this presentation, so you will have this in the next day that you can use. And obviously we are offering those 3 slots. And in 2021, we are also going to be launching a learning design in excellence series, which incorporates some of these aspects in a lot more detail. We'll be sending that out and marketing that in the next 2 months. So thank you for your time, and I hope you have a good rest of your day and look forward to engaging in the future.